Yeah, they're talking directly into Zoom, and you're gonna wear the mic. Us? It's on? Too much in your space? Okay, Rabbi Sai. How do you turn this on? All right, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the final week of this season of the Summer Learning Program. Kedai Nahada, 8 weeks went by so fast, and this is our last week together for this season and next year. We're inviting everybody to Yerushalayim, our Kodesh, starting from tomorrow night. It's a great zchus to be part of this amazing summer program. And I want to thank Hashem for giving me this opportunity. I also want to thank Shmari Garari for spearheading this initiative and being very much involved. Rabbi Rotbaum, together with Yisrael Noach Blank, who runs the shul so amicably and is mamish always roidef l'dvar mitzvah Hashem shebenchim b'chol inyanim b'geshem beruach, and also to Rabbi Lezer Afson, who's been helpful in the summer learning program. Tonight we have a unique zchus because we have a very, very special shir from a very unique Maggid shir, a fellow who is a Talmud Chacham, someone who learns every single day, Yemam B'Layla, and on the side runs an amazing, large e-commerce business. And during the course of his business, you come up to halachic shaylos, and this is a fellow who is oisek b'seich yanim and really understands halacha and business. So together, becomes a shir. What are the challenges from a halachic standpoint in running an e-commerce business? So without further ado, I want to introduce my dear friend, Rabbi Chaim Piekarski.
So I travel quite a bit, and when you travel, especially if you travel to the other side of the world, which I do quite often, I became fascinated with the shape of the world, and specifically the international dateline and how that affects a person who leads a Jewish life. And a lot has been written about it. What is the international dateline? I've crossed it many times, and I'm sure some of you have crossed it if you've been to the other side of the world. The international dateline is an imaginary line that's been drawn from north to south, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, that decides and defines the divider between 2 days. Because if you were to travel, and if you were to follow the sun travels about 600-700 miles an hour. So if you decide to go west to California, for example, and further, and you were to follow right behind the sun, you take off, you're going about 600 miles an hour, and you're following the sun. And you have an infinite amount of fuel, and you keep going behind the sun. And as the sun is setting, you keep following it. And so for you, it's daylight. And you follow it for several days. You've never experienced a sunrise, because it's midday, you're right under the sun. You've never experienced sunset, darkness. You're constantly following the sun. So at some point, you have to change days. When does that happen? When you go from Sunday to Monday to Tuesday. So in order to fix that, they made what's called the international dateline. And they just said, okay, if you're going to travel, even if you're going to follow the sun and you didn't experience a sunrise or a sunset, as soon as you cross this line, you've just changed days. But it's an imaginary line, and the reason it's in the Pacific Ocean is very simple. It's the place that will least affect people. I travel sometimes to the Midwest, and you can have one city next to the other, literally 2 counties, one next to the other, where it's 1 hour in one and 1 hour the next. Somewhere between Detroit and Chicago, there's a time zone change. That time zone change is not a physical change. It's the government has decided that at some point you have to move back an hour in order to accommodate the sun's movement. So approximately every 600 to 800 miles, they pick a time zone. So just think about it. If you're living on one side of the time zone and you work in the other side of the time zone, how confusing that can be, or inconvenience is if you have to cross that time zone just 1 hour. So you need to define that line and say, okay, here it's Sunday, here it's Monday. And that's So if you drew that line somewhere in the middle of massive land, what would happen is that you could be working on Sunday and then going back home and it's still Shabbos, etc. So that line has been drawn somewhere down in the Pacific Ocean, in the middle. A few years ago, there's a little island called Samoa, which is right next to the date line, and they decided that they don't want to be on this side of the date line, they want to switch sides, because most of the people that live there are connected to Australia, which is on the other side of the date line, and on one weekend they just skipped a day. That day went to history, never existed. They went Thursday night, became Friday night, and that was it, it was over. It's an imaginary line. But according to Halacha, where is that line? The line has to be somewhere. The day starts from somewhere. So since there was no international travel many years ago in the time of the Gemara, there is no real references to the Kavat as it's called. It's only contemporary challenge or something that's been discussed. But there are some references that some Paiskim tried to say, okay, there is some references as to where that date line will be. Well, the first point of references is that the world was created from Eretz Yisrael. So really the date line should be drawn from Eretz Yisrael. So if you go out of Eretz Yisrael, you're outside of the date line on one side, and inside you're on the other. That's not practical. So the Paiskim all hold that it goes by landmass. Just the question is how far it goes. And this was the famous machlokas during the war that Chaim held, that the date line ended at the end of landmass of China, and therefore Japan was on the other side of it and really belonged to the side of Hawaii. And there was major shilas during the war and quite a bit of disputes as to should Japan be included on this side or that side. Most poskim agree that whatever the agreed time is, that's the day that we keep. But practically, where does the date line begin or end according to halacha? So it really begins, it starts with Eretz Yisrael, and then just the question is does it end at the end of China, which is the end of landmass, and then you have a few questions about Japan, Australia, which is on the bottom, which actually is on both sides. If you go straight up north from Australia, you're going to hit China somewhere. So on the right side, you're on this side of China, on outside, and on the left side, you're under China. But the idea behind adding that landmass is based on the fact that there's a very interesting halacha when it comes to setting the calendar. And if you've learned Chidush HaChodesh, not the complicated parts, it says very clearly that how do you set the calendar? If you're stuck somewhere and you do not have a Jewish calendar, if you have Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh from the Rambam, he gives you the formula of how to figure out. If you just had a calculator or a pen and paper, you could figure out exactly when Rosh Hashanah will be every single year, and based on that, you can figure out how to set the calendar. And there's a very interesting halacha. It says that if the moiled is before Chatzos, then that's the day of Rosh Hashanah. That's the moiled day. That's Rosh Hashanah. If the moiled is after Chatzos, then we push it off to the next day. And then, of course, if it comes out on a Sunday, a Wednesday, or a Friday, then we push it off an additional day, like Adu Rosh. Those are the two rules of how you set the day of Rosh Hashanah. And based on that, you work your way backwards and you fit in the amount of months, whether Kislev and Cheshvan will have more days or less days. You could play with it. What's the idea behind it? It's simple. If the moiled is going to be before Chatzos, you're not going to see the moon. You only see the moon about 18 hours after it actually hits the eclipse where the sun and the moon are aligned perfectly. If you do Kiddush al Pi Ha'Re'iyah, you're only going to see the moon the next night. So what's the cheshbon that if it's before Chatzos, you're making Rosh Hashanah that day, you're not going to see the moon that night? It's because if you go around the world, 270 degrees around the world, which will be somewhere near the end of the mass of China, that's where you will be able to see the moon if the moiled is before Chatzos in Eretz Yisrael. Then in 18 hours when the moiled, after the moiled, you'll be able to see the moon. Where? Somewhere near the end of China. So that's the cheshbon that they use to say that the Kavat goes to the end of landmass. But I've been always fascinated with it because every time I travel, whether it's Korea or Taiwan or China, I look at the map and I want to see where am I going to go. And with modern travel today, it adds another level of complexity. Airplanes don't necessarily travel east to west. They used to travel east to west and then adjust it north and south based on where you're going. So if you're going to South Africa, you're going to go east and a little bit south. If you're going to somewhere a little bit more north in Russia or in Europe, Scandinavia, you're going to go east and then go a little bit north. But today, no, if you're going to the other side of the world, sometimes they'll actually go all the way up next to the North Pole, because the world is round, is a ball. So it doesn't matter if you go like this, if you have to get to the other side, or if you go like this, right over the top. So many a times I've been literally almost over the North Pole. If you know the concept of degrees, where it's 90 degrees from one half, it's 180 degrees from the top to the bottom, it will be 90 degrees from the middle to the top. And usually when I'm traveling to Korea, they go about 83 degrees, which is literally, you're going near the top. And when you're flying way to the top, what day it is. So practically, what I've come across is the Shilas and Halacha with the dateline. What are those? Basically, 3 Shilas you come across. Number 1, on a Friday. I've been to Japan several times. There are flights from Japan Friday morning. If you leave Friday morning, let's say on a 9 o'clock flight, you're landing in New York 9 o'clock, because the travel is approximately 14 hours, and the difference in time is 14 hours. So it says takeoff 9 a.m., landing 9 a.m. But what happens during those 14 hours when you're actually in the air? You take off, and usually it's going to go east because the jet stream is going east. Planes can go a little faster if they're going with the jet stream than against it. It's like when you go to California, it takes you an extra hour than when you're coming back, because around the world there's this big wind blowing called the jet stream. So they're going to take off, and I'm going to take off from Tokyo, and I'm going to land in New York. I'm going to go east, a little bit northeast. So it's 9 a.m. 2-3 hours later, it's 1 o'clock in Japan. But because I've gone east, the clock over there, it's not 1 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock already in the afternoon. And on a winter, Friday, I've just hit Shabbos. I'm in Siberia, and it's Shabbos in Siberia. I'm flying on Shabbos. A couple of hours later, I'm flying over Hawaii. It's Thursday night, it's Leil Shishi, and I land Friday morning. In the Paskin over here, some Rabbanim say, most Rabbanim say, don't do it. Better not to do it, don't get into that shaila. If you really have to do it, you're going for Pidyon Shvuyim or for something really, really important. There's a Rav in Antwerp, I think his name was Rabbi Weiss. He said he used to go to visit the Bachram in Japan over there. Or people used to go and consult with him about visiting the Bachram in Japan. And he said that as soon as it gets dark, don't move from your seat because you have a tchum problem. Don't eat or drink anything because you have a kiddush problem. Wait till you cross that line. Once you cross that line, it's Leil Shishi, you can start eating cholent and kugel, and you're back to business. So just one practical shaila that you hit when you're crossing the date line that people don't think of. You're traveling northeast. So you're going up Siberia, coming down Alaska. You're coming down. Look at the map, you'll see it. Number 2, another practical shaila. Okay, when do you daven? I take off on a Motzei Shabbos, 1 a.m., and I land in Hong Kong 7 or 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. on Monday morning, because it's a 14 or a 16-hour flight, and they're 12 hours ahead. So you got there 28 hours. So if I leave at 1 o'clock in the morning on Motzei Shabbos, I'm going to land 5 o'clock in the morning on Monday. Do the math, right? What has happened in between? Not necessarily have I experienced a sunrise and a sunset. I leave, it's dark. I get there, it's dark. Nothing's happened. Why? Because I'm following the sun. I'm not behind the sun, so it's dark. Following the moon, so to speak. So in other words, the sun is, let's say, 12 hours ahead of me. So I'm constantly in the dark, like many of us all the time. So what happens? What happened to my shachris? No shachris. Monday morning. Now, on Thursday night, I decide I'm going to stay away from the Friday shaila. On Thursday night, I leave Hong Kong, and I come back the same round. So I have just gained or lost a shachris mincha and ma'ariv. What happens? Or what happens if I'm going up and I'm hitting the North Pole? So I go straight up north. It gets light for a drop because it's Motzei Shabbos 1 o'clock, so 3-4 hours later, you get a twinkle of light because I'm going north, especially in the summertime. But it gets dark like right away after because I'm going west, I'm following the sun. And then again, I land Monday morning. Do I daven Shachris for those few minutes that it's light? Do I not daven Shachris? What do I do? Or the other way around. I come back the opposite way through Europe, and I'll have an extra mincha, Shachris mincha ma'ariv. I don't want to daven. Which shir shel yom to do? What date do I do? What do I do? 8 Shachrises in a week, I can barely do my 7. So just another shaila to think about. Now I've asked Rabbanim, and no one can give me a straight answer. I asked Rabbi Brian, actually. He told me he used to live in Australia. He told me I did the full Shachris mincha and ma'ariv, But he was the only Rav that told me that. The other Rabbanim had told me, Dav garnish ton. Another one told me put on tefillin. So depends if I'm sleeping, if I'm up. I'm not giving you a psak din, but just things to think about that we never thought about. This is the dateline over here that you're crossing and what happens when you cross it back and forth. The third shaila that happens with a dateline is we're very well known. We are very well aware of that, and that's crossing the dateline in Sphira. And the Rebbe was the only one, Yachid B'Doirei, that was very strong about that. Most Rabbanim do not agree or don't hold from that, and they hold that the Sphira is based on the place, not on the person. And if you skip the day, then, maybe you don't have to say a bracha. I don't know what they're paskin. But the Rebbe was very adamant about it. There's a story that Rabbi Elkan had a guest from Japan in his house, and it was a 3-day Yom Tov. It was Shabbos, Sunday, Monday. So Shabbos was Erev Shavuos, and then Sunday, Monday was a 2 days Yom Tov, but he had come from Japan. And so on the way, the Rabbi Yoel introduced him as somebody who just came from Japan. And the Rebbe said to him, Good Shabbos. And then the Rebbe turned back and he said, Good Yom Tov. That's because he was already a day ahead. And so Rabbi Yoel went to the Rebbe and asked the Rebbe, what should he do? He says, guest, he confused him. Good Shabbos, Good Yom Tov. And he said that, the Rebbe said that he should, really for him it's Yom Tov. And Monday is a Yom Chayil, he should keep it b'tzina, just like someone from Eretz Yisrael is keeping it. Whatever, he should still keep it. But he should put on tefillin b'tzina. So we have to take that into account also. And I used to travel a lot during Sphira to China, and I used to take the long route. I used to come through Europe and come back through Europe, or if I was going over the date line, I would make sure to count that those few days without a bracha, both days, and then make sure I cross the date line coming back. Otherwise, you would see me on a weekday with my kapata coming down the street and say, what happened? Let's say I went to China the wrong way. But anyway, so just to think about little things that are contemporary shilas that would not come up even 100 years ago or 150 years ago before there was, travel where you can go back and forth. Just things to think about that I've come across regarding the dateline that I found interesting to share. I would recommend that if you really want to understand the concepts better, there's quite a bit of books out there on it. And if you learn Hilchas Kiddush HaChodesh, you'll also get a little bit better of a flavor on it. Every year when they have Hilchas Kiddush HaChodesh, like the first year is like 1,000 people, and they have the globes and everything. The second year, it's already went over most people's heads. And by the third year, it's not even a crowd like this. It's like, it takes a little time to study it. You take a few prakim once a year. But anyway, I would highly recommend that Hilchas Kiddush HaChodesh gets studied, even when it's not, during the cycle of the Rambam. Coming across, I didn't pick the title of my of what I'm going to talk about tonight, but everybody likes buzzwords, the 5 this, the 5 that. I don't know if I can get to 5, but I'll try. Some of the things that I've come across in running a business is Amira al-Nachri. Amira al-Nachri becomes a challenge when you're running a business that requires attention 24 hours a day. You need to be responsive. There are shilas when it comes to shipping, there are shilas when it comes to answering the phones, etc., etc. I'm going to give a little bit of a background. What's the issue behind Amira al-Nachri? There are two challenges with it, 2 problems. Number 1, it's the idea of maras ayin. And number 2, when you're hiring workers, number 2 is kablanus, schirus, to hire somebody to do work for you on Shabbos. But what's behind it is the Gemara. It's a Mishnah that says, in Shabbos, it says that if a Nachri comes to put out a fire, there's a fire in the village and there's no one in danger, it's just a matter of property, then you're not allowed to tell him to put out the fire. And the Gemara explains in a different daf further on, where the Gemara says clearly that Amira l'nachri shvus. What's the concept of shvus? Shvus is the Rabbanan, Chachamim decided that there are many things that Min HaTorah you're allowed to do on Shabbos, but for various reasons, you're not allowed to do them on Shabbos. One of the reasons is because you might come to do another Isser, a Siyag, a Geder. You don't do this because you might come to do an Isser Deraisa. That's one. Then there's another Isser, especially like with Muktzah, one of the Isserim of Muktzah is just shouldn't have a feel of a Yom Chol. That's one of the reasons for Muktzah. What's the reason behind Amira l'nachri? Especially since there's no such a concept of shlichus by a nachri. When it comes to shlichus, it's clearly a person can only make a shliach, a yid. You learn it out from Atem, Gamatem, Ma'atem b'nei bris, Av shluchachem b'nei bris. You cannot make a nachri, cannot make him a shliach. So what's the problem over here? So the Rambam says, also loyma lagoy lasis lanu melacha b'Shabbos, afal pi she'eina mitzvah ala Shabbos. Afal pi she'omer lem mikaydem haShabbos. So there's no problem with discussing business on Shabbos. Afal pi she'eina tzarich leisa melacha el achar Shabbos. He doesn't even need it. So he's telling him before Shabbos, please do something for me on Shabbos, and I don't need it till after Shabbos, but do it on Shabbos for me. For one reason, it's a siyag that if you're going to tell someone else to do it, you may end up doing it yourself. That's the challenge with Amira l'nachri. Straight to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, because there's no time to do the Torah, B'S Yosef, Bach, or Shach and Ta, whatever the Noisy Kalim would be on Hilchos Shabbos. I don't have it in front of me. Alter Rebbe says, Dina Masker Sadr Merechus Nachri says, Osru Chachamim Loimel Nachri Lasis Lan Melacha b'Shabbos Bein Bechinim Bein B'Schar, even if you're not paying him. V'afa Pisha Ad Malay Koydem HaShabbos Yaser b'Shabbos. V'afa Pisha Ein Yitzorich Leis Melacha Ad Lach HaShabbos. Basically quoting the Rambam. Kshanachri Oise b'Shabbos Oise b'Shlichas Yisrael. He's doing it as a representative, as a shliach. We discussed before, there's no shlichus. V'afa Pisha Ein Oim Shluchas Shalad Nekumaysim in HaTorah El b'Yisrael, and as a shliach l'Yisrael. We cannot appoint a shliach for anything al pi Torah, whatever that shlichus might be. You cannot make a shliach in a Torah if it's in achri. Shneimar b'trum mekenterim gam atem trumas Hashem v'darshacham gam l'rabbi shluchachem mekan shluchach adam shalom kumaisai. However, ma'atem ben bris av shluchachem ben bris aval nachri eine b'Torah shlichus min ha-Torah mikol makom b'divrei seifrim yesh shlichus l'nachri l'chumra. And therefore, over here, the Nachri is considered a shliach of the Yid on Shabbos. He says that there's a remez on the Min HaTorah says Komalacha lo ya'aseh b'hem. It means afal pi al de'acherim. So therefore, we have a challenge that you cannot tell Nachri to do a malacha on Shabbos. So what do you do? So there are exceptions. So there are exceptions to that. I'm not here to give a whole, I'm just here about the work part of it, but there are exceptions, especially people, you leave your refrigerator light on Shabbos, you go cold right? There are exceptions when it comes to someone who is tzasachayla, or if there's babies in the house. There is hatayrim around specific instances, but generally, you cannot appoint a nachri to do work for you on Shabbos, right? And so there's two problems, and both problems have to be overcome. Number one is marasayin. Even if you do not hire the person as an employee, but he's doing work for you, for example, he's doing repairs on your house, he's building your house, and everybody knows that this house is yours. Or he's doing work on your car, and everybody knows, and the car shop is right here in the middle of the neighborhood, and he's working on the sidewalk, and everybody knows he's working on your car. You have a unique car. Als marasayin, even if you didn't hire him, you contracted him, you're not allowed to do that. So there's a maras ayin issue. That's number one. The other thing is you're not allowed to hire him to do it. You're not allowed to pay him to do it, but you can hire him as a contractor. And there are exceptions to how you can get around hiring as a contractor, as long as you do not tell him specifically to do it on Shabbos, and you give him enough time to do it before or after Shabbos. For example, if you come to a dry cleaner's 3 minutes before the Shkia, and you say, I'm leaving on my trip right after Shabbos, please have it ready for me, that would not be allowed, because you're basically instructing him, even if you're paying him by the piece, but you're instructing him to do the work on Shabbos. But if you hand it in randomly and say, whenever you finish it, it's okay. Or you say, I need it for Sunday morning, and they have enough time to do it between Matzah Shabbos and Sunday morning, even if they, for their own convenience, decide to do it on Shabbos, as long as you're not running into the issue of Marasayan, it's not a problem. So what happens, right? Now, what happens when, so I'm just gonna go to the issue that I have at work. What is it? I have customer service, and especially on Yom Tov, Shabbos can be a little bit forgiving, because what happens is that a lot of people know that if you buy something on the weekend, not necessarily someone going to answer your email or pick up the phone. But what happens when Yom Tov is Monday and Tuesday, like it's going to be this year, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, you have literally weekdays, and someone is going to have a problem with their order. They want to know where the order is, or it doesn't work, or they don't know how to use it. And if you don't answer it, they might do a chargeback, they might write a bad rating, or they will. And so you need to have customer service answering or responding to customers during these times. What's the way around it? So Marasayan is not a problem, because they could be sitting in the Philippines or in Venezuela or in Texas. That's not a problem. You can pay them by the piece, and every single email you get $1. Every phone call that you pick up, you get 50 cents. You could pay by the piece, and you could pay more than you would pay by the hour. You can overcome that. But you still have to overcome telling them that they do not have to do it specifically on Shabbos. You can overcome that also. You could say, okay, any email that comes in on Erev Yom Tov or on Erev Shabbos, you need to answer it, but you don't have to answer it on Shabbos. You can answer it on Matzah Shabbos. You give them enough time so that they can answer it at their leisure, and there's no timestamp, and they're not held accountable for when that specific email, that specific task was done. That's a workaround that you can figure out, as long as you're not coming. Of course, you have to make sure that none of those workers are Yidden. So if you hire a company in the Philippines, chances are that that person's a Yid is going to be basically slim to nothing. So that's another question. I don't have a clear answer to it, is where is Shabbos? So I'll give you, there's a company in Manhattan called B&H Photo, and he has a thing that not only he turns off his website on Shabbos. And I know it's not just a PR stunt, because when I was on the West Coast once, when it was 3 hours before, I checked. And it was taka off, and the time of Yom Tov Shabbos, it was off. But in California, it wasn't Shabbos. But the people in California couldn't order, because the owner over here is in New York, and he's saying L'chadaydi already. Comes Matzah Shabbos, he turns it back on. In California, it's still Erev Shabbos, and people are just getting up from their afternoon nap, and they haven't even gone to Mincha. It goes by where he is. What happens if one of the partners is in California for Shabbos? That's a good question. So that's just a chumrah to turn off the website. But in general, where that question, I've never heard a clear answer on it. Such as, I have a partner in my business. I'm in Hong Kong. He's in New York. The business has to keep Shabbos when? When I'm in Hong Kong or when he's in New York? Which one is it? We're 50-50 partners. Not clear, but we could take that in consideration, yeah. So these are just things to think about that people don't realize you come across, that when you're running a business that requires attention on Shabbos, how do you get around it? Now, there are businesses that have to function on Shabbos regardless. For example, a hospital, a nursing home, a rehab center, even a hotel. There are other workarounds for those. I don't have that challenge right now, but I can tell you how that's generally handled is that you have to have a partner that's not Jewish, and you have to make some kind of partnership with him where the profits or that are made on Shabbos are not benefited by the Yid. And there are other workarounds where how do you figure out what the profits are, and you could make different kinds of shtaris and agreements between that partner. But as long as it's clear that this hotel or this nursing home is not only 100% Jewish, is operating as a Jewish operation, but that the profits are not being made by a Yid. But that's a second workaround. Here we're talking about strictly, I need someone to do something for me. Specifically, I cannot do it myself, and I would hope that someone in the Philippines can help me out and help my customer and satisfy my customer. So that is the concept of working on Shabbos that I've come across. One of the other issues that I've come across is what is the responsibility between, anybody have any questions? No questions, good. I'm so clear, wow.
When did you find out one of your workers after the fact was Jewish?
So that's a shiloh for a Rav, but generally there are rules for how you can verify these things. I mean, if you're hiring people that live in neighborhoods that have a Jewish population, then you have to think about that. But if you're hiring companies that are, overseas, such as the Philippines is known for, having customer service, etc. So generally you will go by, you go by generally what the population is, or what the chazaka is, unless someone tells you clearly that they are Jewish. The same issue would be if you have products sitting in an Amazon warehouse. Amazon encourages Amazon sellers to sell what's called FBA, fulfillment by Amazon. People will get their orders faster, the product will get listed as a higher ranking if it's sitting in Amazon's warehouse. Now there are no issues with actually having Amazon ship on your behalf on Shabbos, because there are a heterim for that also. But what happens if you know that in that particular warehouse is a heavy Jewish population? That may be a challenge. But Rubam Kukulam, we're talking about here that Anachrim, that's in an average warehouse sitting somewhere, the workers over there on Shabbos are most likely not going to be Jewish unless you know that they are. In today's workforce, it's very different than it was years ago. Years ago, an employee would basically be working by the hour. You got up in the morning, you went to work, you clocked in, you had a boss sitting in the corner watching your cubicle and making sure that you're working every single minute, whatever it is. And then when you clocked out, how long did you go out for lunch? You have to clock out, take your break, mincha, cigarette break, lunch, all these things. It was very rigid. Your work was measured by the amount of hours that you worked. This comes back to actually the origins of working are when people would work in agriculture and they were day laborers and they would work from the morning until the night. And we have a Mishnah that talks about that. The relationship between a boss, employer, and an employee tells specifically what are obligations one to the other. It's the Mishnah above Metzia. The Mishnah says, if someone hires day laborers, and he tells them, you have to be here as soon as sun rises. I need you standing outside the field, and I need you working till sunset, lahariv. And you didn't make up any specific time. You just hired them for the day. The Mishnah tells you exactly what the obligations is. In a place where the minig isn't to start exactly at sunrise and to end mamish right before sunset. The minig is that there is some wiggle room. There is some extra cushion in the morning where a person can actually have their morning and have their evening. You cannot force them to work that. He didn't agree on hours. He said, I need you for the day. What's the default? The default says you go kiminam gamokim. What is that? And if there's extra time, but makim shenagu lazen, and then there's other minagim over here of if you have to feed them or not. So we see two different things over here happening in the Mishnah at the same time. One of them is a default setting of a day laborer is morning till night, as long as there's daylight outside. The counterbalance that it is minhag hamakayim. But the default thing, it starts with the obligation of an employee is to work every single minute of the day. It goes even more. In Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah brings down, he says, Lo yahaya minig ba'ir, there was no minig. Sha'amar lem ani soicher eschem kedin Torah, chayavim latz mebeisam mizrichas hashemesh, v'lasam lach hatzilcham. They have to work literally from morning till night if there was no agreement as to what to do. Why am I bringing this up? People don't work from morning till night right now. In today's workforce, it's more flexible. It's not rigid where someone comes exactly 9, leaves at 5 o'clock, works exactly those hours. Maybe some jobs like a warehouse worker, but generally most jobs is a little bit more flexible. You work a few hours, you take a break, you daven mincha, you eat lunch, then at night you're going to have to make some phone calls, answer some emails at night. When you go to Amazon, Amazon workers told me that they have to answer their emails even at night within 2 hours from wherever they get an email, unless they're sleeping. So it's not just exactly by the hour. So what's the right balance between an employer and an employee when it comes to what we call the unspoken? There's no manual that says you have to work exactly from this time to this time thinking, and from this time to this time creating and coming up with ideas, and from this time to this time actually working at the computer, etc. It's a little bit more flexible because we're really not only looking at actually production, but we're looking at results. We measure employees not only by what they put in, but we measure employees also by what the output is and how successful and what they bring. But on the other hand, we expect employees to put in those amount of hours or energy or emotional energy even more. And so what's the right balance? And so if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, and you start from the Gemara, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, it's very clear that the default setting for a person is that he has an obligation to do their best for their employer, unless otherwise agreed. That's the default setting. We have a very interesting Halacha in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. It says that just like a balabas, just like a balabas is not allowed to steal, shortchange an employee's salary, even a little bit. He refers to him as schara ani. You're not allowed to shortchange. He's called it ligzal, stealing. And you're not allowed to delay payment of an employee. That's one line. A person, an employee, is not allowed to cheat and shortchange the employer. How? He has to be careful when it comes to time. Time is very important. You have to be makpid on time. That's the first halacha that he brings. Then he brings a second halacha and he says that you have to work b'chol kaicha. You have to give it your full energy. And he brings an example from Yaakov Avinu. And then there is a third thing. What's that third thing? Is the person has to be responsible that off hours, they also have to be careful what they do. They have to get a good night's sleep. You're not allowed to take a second job at night, because by day you're going to be tired, and you're not going to give it your full energy. So what comes out from over here? 3 separate things the Alter Rebbe brings in the Shulchan Aruch. But he brings it very interestingly, he brings it in a different order than the Rambam. The Rambam brings these same 3 things, but he brings them in a different order. The Rambam starts with an employee, ene par rashai, lasis malachta belayla. You're not allowed to work at night, because if you work at night, you're not going to be able to function by day. He brings that first. And then he says, because that's the basic obligation that an employee has to employer is, if you're going to get a good night's sleep, then you're going to be able to work the next day. Then he says, while you're at work, the Rambam says, he's taking it to the next level. You're not allowed to waste time. He says, yivatel matkan or matbekan. That's called stealing. If you're not giving it your full time, your full energy, then that's also. In other words, the first thing is you're not allowed to sleep at night. That's basic. That's the aleph base of you're not allowed to shortchange your employer, even if you're going to work full time, by working a night shift. you became a mashgiach at night in the wedding hall, and you stayed up at night, or you did night shift in UPS, and then the next morning you come nice and fresh, and the day's work looks like you had a day's work. Next thing is, even if you come in nice and fresh, but you waste time, that's the second thing, that's an extra thing. Then the third thing is, he says, b'chol koichai. You have to work b'chol koichai like Yaakov Tzaddik. It's three separate things. Three separate things. One is higher level than the next. And he brings a raya that therefore, he says, Yaakov Tzaddik, b'chol koichi avadis avicha. And he's talking to his daughters, and he said, I gave your father all my koyach. Chol koichi. More, above and beyond. And therefore, he got the schar of a yifrit zeish moed moed. That's what the Rambam says. The Alter Rebbe turns this around. This is a chiddush that the Rebbe does. The Rebbe takes this, he turns it around. He says the Alter Rebbe doesn't do it in this order. According to this, there's basically three things. The first one is basically one level higher than the next, according to this. The first level is, according to the Rambam, that you're not allowed to, you have to get a good night's sleep, don't take a night shift. That's basic. You're stealing from your employer because the quality of your work is going to be bad. If you're putting together, even if you're just assembly, basic, mindless work, you're going to be shortchanging. Never mind that if you have to give it your mind and you didn't get a good night's sleep. That's basic. And the second thing is, you're not allowed to waste time while you're on the job. That's not as basic as the first one. And the third one is you have to give b'chol koich. That's already extra above and beyond. Shulchan Aruch Rav, the Alter Rebbe switches it around. He says you're not allowed to waste time. You have to work b'chol koich and get yourself a good night's sleep. What does the Alter Rebbe do different over here? And this is the Rebbe's chiddush. The Alter Rebbe puts them all, they're all on the same level. The b'chol koich of Yaakov Avinu is not extra. It's not extra credit. It's basic. The Alter Rebbe puts them all together, that an employee's obligation to an employer to work b'chol koichai, not only that he's not allowed to work a night shift, not only he's not allowed to waste time, but b'chol koichai, that's the basic. It's part and parcel of basic. He takes the Rambam's words, turns them around and says, if you're an employee, your obligation to your employer is b'chol koichai. That's out of the gate. That's the default setting. And so, as an employee, you have to realize the achrayus and that you have to an employer. Now, of course, I'm an employer, and I'm preaching to my employees now who are watching and listening to this. But I'm going to say that the counterbalance to that is that an employer has to take care of his employees in such a way to motivate them that they shouldn't only do it b'chol koiche because they're going to be vayifret zeish moed moed according to the bracha of Yaakov Avinu. But if you're an employer, you want to motivate your employees to work b'chol koichai, even if they didn't learn this Sifr in Shulchan Aruch, even if they don't know that Yaakov Avinu worked 24 hours a day b'chol koichai. You want to be smart, and instead of pulling out the Shulchan Aruch, Siman in Shulchan Aruch, and telling the employee when you interview them, you better work b'chol koichai, or else, is to create a work environment that creates an environment that they want to work b'chol koich, that they enjoy to work b'chol koich, so that if they're not working b'chol koich, they feel underperforming, they feel unfulfilled. That's the key to a good employer. The employee's achrayus is b'chol koich. Now, what? How do you do that? You give chant on Thursdays. That cannot be explained in 15 minutes. At 10 after Ma'ariv, $1,000 check, and I'm going to tell you the secrets for a separate session. Basically, it's a good question. How do you do that? If you treat your employees like a mensch, and you create opportunity, and you create an environment where they can grow, and where they can feel accomplished, and they can feel part of something bigger than themselves, and they feel appreciated. There's so many different things as an employer you can do. Yeshua talks to a lot of business people, and I'll give a plug for YE over here, who encourages employers who are growing their businesses is to treat their employees, not only treat them basically nice, like it says in Shulchan Aruch, but you want to treat employees and think about it. How is it for them? And what are the needs that an employee has? Not just needs of financial needs. That's the first reason they come to work. But today, employees don't come to work only because they need the money. They have many, many options. Employees come to work because it's a place where they feel they belong to something. They feel like they accomplished something. They feel like there's purpose to what they do. They feel like they're appreciated. They're recognized. and they feel some part of something more important and bigger than just at the thing that they're doing themselves. And that's, for an employee to create that kind of environment, it's a full-time job. The employer has to work b'chol koichai in order to create an environment that employees want to work b'chol koichai. And that's something that's not easy, that's not even easily said, never mind, not easily done. One more point. We'll talk about as a business owner or as a worker, same thing. What is the balance? How much effort do you have to put in? We see that some people put in a lot of effort and they grind water. You see some people almost like buying a lottery ticket. They try something, poof, it takes off. So what's the right balance? What we say between hishtadlus and emunah and bitachon. So let's back up a minute. Let's take a look what happened in the Midbar. Very instructive. In the Midbar, Yidden were taken care of. Complete service. They didn't have to build any houses. None are covered. They didn't have to buy any clothing. They didn't have to clean their clothing. They had a be'er. They had all the water that they needed. And of course they had man min hashamayim. Completely taken care of. They lived on pure emunah and bitachon. By the way, what's the difference between emunah and bitachon? Emunah is you believe that the Eibishter feeds the world. Bitachon is you believe the Eibishter is going to feed you now. In your situation is actually going to come out good. And in the Midbar we found that what did we find? That not only the Yidden believed, and we see sometimes it was challenging for the Yidden. Sometimes they were challenged. When there was no water for one day, there was an uproar. There was a riot. It was difficult. And the Eibishter was trying to teach them during these 40 years how to rely on the Eibishter completely. And the man and everything else was training. They didn't get a full house, a full storehouse at the beginning of the week, enough supplies for the week or for the month. The Eibishter could have made a nest that once a year comes out enough man, and he could have made could have put it straight into their storehouse, and they would have had the peace of mind knowing, Baruch Hashem, the storehouse is full, the bank account is full. I don't have to worry tomorrow. No. Every single day, leftovers were a no-no. No refrigeration, no leftovers. He left that over for the next morning, and then we know, worms. So the Eibishter says, I'm going to give you food for today, and after you finish, you're not putting anything away for leftovers, and tomorrow morning, you're going to believe that there's going to be man coming down again. And this is what the Eibishter instilled into the Yidden, those 40 years in the Midbar, that everything that the Eibishter gives comes from the Eibishter in a way where you have to have belief and trust that it will come, without any doubt. But we find that the Eibishter, while he was training them to do emunah and bitachon and to have completely trust in the Eibishter, he was training them for a higher level. What was the higher level? Higher level is that even if they had to put in some effort themselves, they still had to know that it's coming from the Eibishter. Where do you find that? You find that by the man. The man, regardless of the fact that it came down every single day fresh, they still had to go outside and pick it up. And it says actually that there were 3 different levels. It's a tzaddik and beinim and Chaim. Each one had to do some level of effort. They had to open the tent door. If he was a tzaddik, he had to bend down, pick it up. He had his meal for the day. A beinoni had to do some walking. A rasha, a little more. Someone told me a word. Says, what did it say? Vayancha vayarivecha. And then he gave you the man. He says those who were ashamed, they were ashamed to go out all the way, so they starved instead. What was happening over here is while the Eibishter was giving us the instruction and the koyach and the infusing in us the fact that we have to rely on the Eibishter for every single daily one of our daily needs, at the same time he was telling us that even if you have to do some ishtadlus, you should know that it still comes from the Eibishter. The opposite of that is the biggest warning that Moshe Rabbeinu says is chas v'shalom, you should come to Eretz Yisrael and you're going to be well established. You're going to have your orchards and your fields and your houses. And what's going to happen? For 40 years they were trained, don't think like that, despite the fact that you have to learn to do some effort, just like you know that by opening the tent and stretching out your hand and picking up the man, it was obvious that that effort had nothing to do with you. The Abish to put that man right in front of your tent. You just had to stretch out your hand. So you knew that by stretching out your hand, you had nothing to do. No one would say in the afternoon, on a nice Thursday afternoon in the Midbar, look at the man that I got today. It was obvious, this man min hashamayim. So the Eibishter was teaching them that even though you're going to do some ishtadlus, I need you to do some effort. Don't chas v'shalom get the koich v'yitzim yadi, because it can quickly lead to that once you're well established in Eretz Yisrael. And what happens further? When they come into Eretz Yisrael, the Eibishter again trains them. What does he say? He says, you're going to get a big portion of land, and now you're going to plant, and you're going to grow, and you're going to harvest. And in every phase, in every step of the way, he gives them a mitzvah satluyis ba'aretz, in order to not only the opportunity to do a mitzvah and every step of the way, but it's an opportunity to show gratitude and to recognize that it wasn't koichi v'yitzim yadi that brought me this harvest. It was the Eibishter. Even though you worked hard, even though you planted, even though you did a business deal and you got the great deal and you bought this for a great deal and you sold that for a great amount and you were smart and you strategized and you outsmarted and all of that. Every phase and every step of the way, starting from Arla, 3 years, you can't touch it. Then it starts growing, Bikurim, put on a red band, right away recognize, to say thank you, gratitude. Even before you take the produce home, leket, shikha, payan, every single phase of the step of the way, you bring it home, truma, meiser sheni, meiser ani, netaravoi. And on top of that, the Eibishter says, you have extra tzedakah and chesed, give. You have to give him, and you have to give, and you have to give. So it's all based around the same thing, no different than when the man came to the front of your tent, and all you had to do was stick out your hand, stretch out your hand, and pick up that man. The same thing over here, even though you're going to have to do all these things. You're going to have to plow, and you're going to have to irrigate, and you're going to have to harvest and store and all of that, and then go to the market and trade it for this price and that price. It's the same thing. Your ishtadlus was only there, so while you're doing it, you should say thank you to the Eibishter. You should daven before it should be successful. While after it happens, you show gratitude, and that is something that has to be in every phase of the way, regardless of whether you're harvesting agriculture or whatever industry that you're in. The same rules apply. I'll take it even further. Today, in these few days in Chitas and Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is very strongly advocating tzedakah, especially tzedakah in Eretz Yisrael. And he takes the whole idea of tzedakah and he says that what a Baal tzedakah can do, Talmid Chacham cannot do with his learning. Yes, a person has to do limud Torah, and of course we know all what limud Torah is. Chachma of the Raisa, Imamish. When you're learning, you're holding on to the Eibishter. When you're learning the Torah of the Eibishter, Imamish grasping the Eibishter himself. But what a Baal Tzedakah, Baal Chesed achieves cannot be achieved by what the Alter Rebbe refers to as a Talmid Chacham. It's us Balei Asakim. Business people, workers, employees, employers, anybody who has any trade, any skill, any craft, who's making money and using that money for the right purposes for tzedakah, that is something that can only be achieved by the Baal Asik. And it goes even further. Not only does a Baal Asakim have the ability to serve the Eibishter in a way that a Talmid Chacham doesn't have, because he can spread his wealth and he can actually be active in the act of giving tzedakah. I mean, we saw that the Rebbe was always encouraging, the Rebbe was encouraging to be Moisef in Talmud Torah, and the Rebbe was encouraging always to give tzedakah. The whole concept of dollars is to encourage a person that he should give tzedakah all the time. It wasn't just the amounts that you give. You should always be in giving mode. Always giving. Even if it's $1 at a time. You're a Baal Asik, you have money, you have to be a giving person. And you have to be giving tzedakah. Kifi yechaltai, according to your ability. But it goes deeper. Alter Rebbe and Torah Or in the Maimer of Maim Rabbim explains that it says Maim Rabbim leichel lechabes esahava, and it says they won't be able to. Alter Rebbe says not only they won't be able to, you cannot achieve a certain level of avodas Hashem without the Maim Rabbim, and that's why they're called Mei Noach, calm waters. They're waters. The Maim Rabbim, the Mei Mabel are referred to Mei Noach. Why are they called Mei Noach, calm waters? Is because a person who goes into business and he gets completely inundated with tirdus and daigas parnasa. We know that the tirdus and daigas parnasa are the hardest part of parnasa. Going to work is one thing, schlepping yourself and doing is one thing, but the daigas and the tirdus parnasa that a person has, and despite those, he turns those around and he's able to serve the Eibishter, he can achieve what a person who's sitting and learning cannot achieve. That's the Maila of the Baila Asakim. Doesn't matter if you're an employer, an employee, a contractor, you're involved in business, and you bring B'chal D'rechecha De'eyu into the workplace, wherever you are, you're able to serve the Eibishter in a way that no one else can. And if you change that mindset and you go into the workforce and you just look at things differently and you understand that you're here for a purpose and it's not your smarts, it's not your strategies, it's all the bracha from the Eibishter and you have to put in your ishtadlus. When you recognize that, you start looking at everything differently. I was in a hotel a few weeks ago and most hotels have the elevator in the middle of the floor. So when you go out, you can go to the right, to the left. Usually they're strategically placed. Some hotels, very few, have the elevator at the end of the hallway. So when you go out, you have to go only one way, not the other. So I was disoriented. I had stayed in several hotels that week. So, it's like you park your car and then you go out and you move it at night and you forgot. And then your head, it's the old parking space and you think your car is gone. And so I got out of the elevator and I made a left, but there was no rooms on the left. And the housemaid was standing over there and she says, "Are you sure you're going the right way?" And I said, "That's a question a person should be asking themselves all the time." And she looked at me like, "Huh?" And I said, "I'm supposed to be saying that to myself, not to her." Thank you.